My remarks on the record.
You're on the record.
Could professional women decide the upcoming federal election? According to Development Strategies, the 2022 federal election could be determined by the female professional vote. Swinburne PhD researcher Yolanda Vegas investigates women and government, politics and policies. And she says, considering the lack of respect illustrated by a long list of political leaders over recent years and the March for Justice, it's logical that women are standing up and demanding change. To obliterate the status quo, women need to get into the driver's seat. They're tired of screaming out for justice and respect. Hence, the current imbalance will look very different after the election. Now, her new research finds that women working within the Australian government have historically been the drivers of change instigating pro-women policies. Joining me now on the phone is Yolanda Vega, Swinburne PhD researcher. Good morning, Yolanda.
Good morning, Jeff, and good morning to your listeners at the Sound Alternative.
Thank you very much. Well, it is a very different environment leading into this federal election. You've only to look at the hullabaloo last week to see there's some very different subjects on the mind of the electorate.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really interesting time, I think, generally, but because we are leading into a variety of elections, primarily the federal election, we're seeing more and more women standing up. Now, that's not something that we've seen before, because as we know, women have in general been unable to do anything outside the home in the past, right? So in general, women are the carers of the children and the home and the gardens and the animals and the elderly. So once you got a job, or even if you didn't have a job and you had kids, your prime time was about taking care of the family. But we're now at a point where our demographic has changed. So once upon a time, as I said, women had a very specific role in our society and they were expected to behave a certain way. All of those archaic notions have now disappeared. So women, and mainly professional women, and we're seeing that with the professional migrant women, as well as professional women from an Anglo or, an Australian background, saying, hang on a minute, enough is enough. We have been asking for equity for more than 100 years. We have been asking for our childcare systems to be equitable. That still hasn't happened. We have been asking for equal pay for many years, and even though the policy was changed back in the 1980s, in 1984, when Susan Ryan passed or pushed for the legislation to go through, and we obtained the Sex Discrimination Act from that bill, thank goodness, even though that was already legislated and it is now law, meaning that it is illegal, right, to pay women less than men for the same job, companies continue to ignore the law. So it's not surprising that 125 years approximately since we got the right to vote and sit in Parliament, that we're going, hang on a minute, the boys have had a good go at it. They haven't delivered equity for both sexes. It's time women got into the driver's seat and said to the other people currently in power, take a break, gentlemen. Go home and look after the children for a while, because we're now ready to take over to ensure that we don't have to wait more than 100 years to obtain equality in Australia.
Well, it's been a frustratingly slow process even getting to where we are now. I mean, well, it's just so illogical to be excluding half the brain power of humanity. Yeah. And then you think back to how difficult it was for people like Edith Cowan, when she was the first female sitting in Parliament, and there wasn't even a female toilet in the WA Parliament building.
Yes, And it's interesting that you mentioned Cohen, because it was still, all those years later, it was still really hard for Bishop as well, you know, and she is a representative of Western Australia, and she came out on many occasions and said, you know, it's just not right. What's going on is not right. And even though she claimed she wasn't a feminist, after she left the parliament, she spoke about being the only female in the room and being completely ignored. And we see that across the board. We saw that with the March for Justice. Our leader didn't come out and say, hi, women, I hear you, or people, because there was both men and women there. This is not just a women's issue. Both men and women are realising that it is the continuous unfairness that we're witnessing across health, economic participation, education, and political participation is no longer viable, as you said, because we have the majority of women in Australia today, the majority of PhDs in Australia today are women. There are more women graduating from universities than ever before. So you're absolutely right, Jeff. Our brain power needs to be utilised if we are to move forward and increase I can't find the word. We need to increase how we recover from COVID and other issues. So we need more brain power than ever before. And remember, in Australia, the majority of people are women. So it's not just 50%, it's almost 51%. It is ridiculous. And it's time now, and we're seeing it. It's not my prediction. It is time, and we are seeing the sisterhood standing up, listening to Grace Tame, listening to Miss Higgins, listening to Chanel Contos, and many others like her, like these young women inside and outside Parliament, saying, no more. We are tired of the rhetoric. We are tired of the discussion. You know, we saw this government, our federal government, bringing in the Prime Minister for Women and the Minister for Security for Women. And, you know, we don't need more ministers. We need action. We need policies that provide outcomes. And my research indicates that without key performing indicators, if we don't give government employees KPIs, we're never going to reach the outcomes that we want and expect as Australians, and especially as women living in Australia.
Well, Yolanda, the prospect of change itself is exciting. What in your research has pointed to that prospect of change?
Well, my research, which is unpublished, because I've literally only just finished my PhD after 6 years of examining what has been going on. So what I set out to do was look for the positives, right? So I used the appreciative inquiry method to go and look at what has historically occurred that has helped women's fight for justice and equality. And one of the things that my research illustrates is that the women within the machinery of government, so, you know, the bureaucrats, the ministers, the advisors, the women have been the agents for change. So going back to the suffragettes, moving on to the femocrats that instigated and pushed for the first gendered budgets in the world, which then were taken up by a variety of other countries, and the United Nations women have also been using our data and our best practices, but now Australia doesn't have gendered budgets anymore. So what I wanted to do was understand how we can move forward our fight for equity in Australia by using, or potentially by using, policies and programs that had delivered success in the past. And that was one of the really interesting findings, which apparently is unique in academia. I'm not an academic. This is my PhD, but, you know, prior to that, I was in the corporate environment and in the not-for-profit environment. So apparently this finding that women have been the agents of change is going to be contributing a great deal of information to the academic research. And I think also of the utmost importance is that now that we have that data, we now better understand why women are now saying, okay, it's our turn to do it. Because if women have been in the past the ones that have instigated and driven change for women, like Susan Ryan with the Sex Discrimination Act, I understand now after this research that it is only women that are going to be able to drive more significant changes for women in Australia.
Well, how do the parties shape up then when it comes to gender equity? I mean, the Libs, Labor, the Greens, are any of them performing well?
Look, I'm not going to be commentating on that because that's not part of my research.
Yeah.
The data that I can present to you and your listeners is look at the facts. How many women have led those parties? We've only ever had one female leader, and that was Labor. We've never had a female leader in the Liberal Party, and we've never had, or we don't currently have a female leader in Liberals. In the Greens. We have had Christine as the leader in the Greens, but she's now unfortunately gone. So it trickles down. If the priority of the leader is based on masculine or male priorities, then women tend to be forgotten, and that's what the research says. It's not that men are bad and women are good. I'm not saying that, and the research does not indicate that. What I'm saying is that because women and men have different priorities, especially when they are in leadership positions, women tend to have better ability, better skill sets to drive female or pro-women policy forward more so than men have done in the past.
Just finally as well, Yolanda, slightly more hidden, a little bit more subtle, is the makeup of government bureaucracy, the non-elected officials. How do we shape up in Australia in that direction? I mean, are we approaching gender equality in the background, in the bureaucracy? Because that's obviously going to drive a lot of change.
Oh, absolutely, it's going to drive a lot of change. And look, we have had some, but unfortunately with a lot of other pro-women policies, we tend as a nation to take one step forward and then fall back 2 steps. So there is data that indicates that more and more women are taking up positions or leadership positions within government departments, but we have a long, long way to go because the great majority are still men, and they are the ones, again, like the politicians, that lead on based on what is a priority for the male and being unaware of what women really need. And, we only need to look at our Treasury Department, as I mentioned before. Gendered budgets delivered extraordinary results for women in this country, but they disappeared in the mid-90s, never to be seen again. Now, why haven't they come back? Is it because the government wants to ignore women, or is it because Treasury keeps forgetting about women, or because everybody thinks that men and women are equal?
Well, I mean, the latest round of tax cuts and demonstrably weigh in favour of male taxpayers over female taxpayers.
Absolutely. And you can go even further and say, well, look, and this also came up in my research, the problem here is that when we look at specific policy, we think of it as a positive thing when it's infrastructure, right? When it's a masculine sort of traditional job. But then when it's about childcare or other pro-women requirements, we think of them as costs. And there's been other advocates talking about this over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Why is it a cost when it benefits women, and why is it an investment when it benefits men?
It's who has the control of the terminology, isn't it?
Exactly. And the money. The money, Jeff.
Yolanda Vega, thank you so much for joining us from Swinburne Uni this morning, and good luck with the completion of your PhD.
Thank you so much. That will be done this week. And I just, if I can just have one extra second to ask
Please.
your voters, at this next federal election, please don't go back to your default routines and just vote for a party, because when you're voting for the Senate, which is one of the most powerful instruments of the Australian government, I can assure you that the majority of your listeners do not know who represents your state in the Senate. The Senate is very important. They are very powerful, and voters must understand who they are voting for when it comes to the Senate, because they're going to be making the decisions. They are far more powerful than the Prime Minister of this country.
I am not going to add to that at all. Yolanda Vega, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for your time, Jeff. Much appreciated.
It's a pleasure. That's Yolanda Vega, PhD researcher, I should say, at Swinburne Uni, talking to us there about the effect that professional women are going to have in deciding the upcoming federal election.